In spring 1934, the photographer Lucia Moholy arrived in London as an emigre. She had been living in Germany since 1914, working primarily in publishing and then at the Bauhaus, where she took more than 500 glass negatives. And this is actually a body of work that Robin Schuldenfrei has recently and eloquently written on. Having had to leave these behind in the haste of exile and starting anew in England, Moholy set up a portrait studio in her Mecklenburg Square apartment. Her sitters were varied and seemed to have been largely friends and acquaintances. Many belonged to England's intelligentsia, professors of the sciences and history, writers and publishers. And here's the literary critic and editor Edward Garnett, who had played an important role in getting D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers published. There is little documentation around how or why these photographs came to be, but they seem to have been intended primarily for publicity purposes. Shortly after he died in 1937, the image of Garnett appeared in the London Times with a relatively didactic caption, a recent portrait of the late Edward Garnett, and notably unattributed to Moholy, which was the case with much of her work. As she explained in 1974 to Colin Ford, who was then photo curator at the National Portrait Gallery, the majority of sitters have been or were in those days in the public eye. Two of my favorite are these. On your left, the British Quaker Ruth Fry in a somewhat candid pose, sort of gingerly leaning to one side. And on the right, the modern languages scholar Inez Spender, who at the time was married to Stephen Spender, the poet, novelist, and member of Britain's Communist Party. A comparison with contemporary publicity photographs demonstrates that although her choice of sitters was eclectic, her style was remarkably consistent and rather unusual at that. Consider this far more static depiction of Ruth Fry 10 years earlier, also in the National Portrait Gallery, in which the sort of top-down artificial lighting washes out her otherwise rounded sculptural features, which are come across quite clear in the Moholy photograph. By contrast, Moholy exploited shadow to striking effect, often obscuring facial features entirely. She also consistently employed a very shallow depth of focus so that minute details pop off the page, while the rest of the sitter recedes into a haze. And you can see that especially in Fry's brooch here in the edge of her blouse. As Moholy later wrote in her book, 100 Years of Photography, on which we'll hear more in the next paper, this kind of portraiture, referring in part to her own production, drew on a tradition of amateur-inflected portraiture that did away with backgrounds, pedestals, cases, retouching, and what Moholy described as the quote-unquote soft focus picture. It also drew on what she calls modern German object photography of the 20s, and she likely had in mind here the German genre of Sachfotografie. Quote, and I'm quoting Moholy now from her book, "For the first time in the history of photography, it was not only the shape, delineation, and expression of the human face, but the sculptural details of the head and texture of skin, hair, nails, and dress, which became attractive subjects to the photographer," unquote. That photographer was in part Moholy herself, who was reflecting in no uncertain terms on the minimal success of her entree into studio portraiture, which she had largely given up by the time her book was published in 1939. So it's really this period between 1934, when she arrives, 35, and 1938 that's the subject of this talk here. To the general public in Western Europe, she continued, citing from her book, this style appears strange and exotic. They find it interesting and worth discussing, but few of them want to have their portraits taken in this way. England in particular has conserved a strong taste for the soft focus, gentle and placid portrait photograph of the Reynolds and Gainsborough style. And here she's citing the two 18th century painters, not photographers, importantly. Moholy had developed this quote-unquote sculptural approach to portraiture during her tenure at the Bauhaus in the mid-20s, where she photographed the school's products as part of a systematic effort to assemble an archive of its achievements. It was at the Bauhaus that Moholy cultivated an approach to product photography that she later applied to portraiture, preferring natural light, often coming from one side. Here, this is set up by a window in the metal workshop. A neutral background, she's using a roll of paper here, and details of contour, surface, and texture, as opposed to dramatic arrangements. Swap out thing for person, and one sees how Moholy translated this physiognomy of the object to living sitters. This was already evident in the mid-1920s when she took her first portraits. In this quite remarkable photograph of her Bauhaus colleague, Interchange, what immediately captures our attention is not only this glint on his eye, but most importantly, this protruding lapel on his suit jacket, which when you see the print is in extremely sharp focus. While by contrast, the delineation of his head, and especially his ear over here, kind of recedes into the background. This displacement of focus from the transmission of personhood to what Moholy calls a sitter's sculptural details reaches new levels in the English portraits. Especially this one of the British-German journalist Frederick Augustus Voigt, whose spectacles, and particularly the edge closest to the camera, which is here, present themselves as a kind of specimen of high precision plastic and optical glass. The camera's intense focus on this object is matched only by the gravity of Voigt's stare. Such details not only make for an unusual style of portraiture, they also probe the boundary between object and subject, between the wholeness of an individual and the substitutional part logic of the commodity. Here, in two other Bauhaus-era portraits, Moholy challenges the notion of the face as a privileged term of the genre, using the hands to obscure the eyes in a kind of hybrid hand portrait. Or in the next photograph, in the figure's head, seen from behind, where the curvature of the skull delineated in the eclipse shape of sheen of light on the hair, sort of contrasts with the geometric stripes of the figure's shirt in what is almost like the kind of abstract figuration. These remarkable complications of traditional portraiture challenge the viewer to consider exactly where it is that the identity of the sitter lies. And in this respect, I'd argue they should be seen along similar attempts to destabilize subjectivity through photography at the Bauhaus, such as self-portraits by Florence Henri and Marianne Brandt, to name just two of the more prominent examples. Moholy didn't go to such extremes with her British portraits, but she applied this approach to her new cultural context instead of sitters, generating something like a paradoxical anti-portraiture that casts the subject as an amalgamation of incidental detail. The status of the individual is, I propose, one of the most interesting questions to ask of this body of work. And I've so far been talking about her formal choices and identity of sitters, but one would also have to consider the conditions that led to the emergence of the work in the first place. And that's to say the experience of exile itself as a confrontation with the precarity of modern subjectivity. Although Moholy rarely spoke of her emigration, she gave a brief account of it in 1947 in a letter to her friend Heinrich Jacobi, a fellow German emigre, but to Switzerland. In that letter, she dates the beginning of her emigration not to late spring 1934 when she arrived in London, but to almost a year earlier, to spring 1933. Summer 1933, when Moholy had to flee Berlin in August, following the arrest in her own apartment of Theodor Neubauer, then a well-known member of the German Communist Party, the KPD, and a government representative. So enter Neubauer, who becomes a crucial element in the story of the English portraits. At the time of Neubauer's arrest, he and Moholy were having an affair. It was extramarital on both sides. Although short-lived, it seemed to have been meaningful, with the backs of several of her photographs from 1929 to 1933 bearing the stamp Lucia Moholy Neubauer, as though she had taken on his last name. The two could have met as early as 5 years prior, in 1923, when Moholy arrived at the Bauhaus, which was then in Weimar. In those years, Neubauer was a KPD representative in the Thüringen State Parliament, seated in Weimar. His platform included educational reform, in which he had earned his doctorate degree. His intellect and political passion would have appealed to Moholy, who was herself highly educated, self-reliant, and ambitious. The Bauhaus's secretary at the time, Alfred Lang, who sought out Thüringen's leftist politicians, seems to have recruited Neubauer's support in upcoming parliamentary debates on the school's public funding. And there exists at least one letter dated to 1922 in which Walter Gropius thanks Neubauer for campaigning on behalf of the school. It's also possible that Moholy only really got to know Neubauer after 1928, when she and her then husband, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, left the Bauhaus and moved to Berlin. Although she and Moholy-Nagy separated in the months following, she continued to photograph his work, predominantly his stage sets for the Courtauld Opera in Berlin. And the director of the Courtauld, Hans Courtauld, was a good friend, and it could have been through Courtauld and the Courtauld Opera House, which was a gathering site for Berlin's leading artists, intellectuals, and politicians, that Moholy came into contact with Neubauer, though we're not sure. In any case, by 1929, Moholy had taken a series of portraits of Neubauer in conversation with Clara Zetkin outdoors. There are at least 12 photographs of this sitting in Moholy's estate, in her papers. Shots that primarily portrayed Zetkin and the expressive qualities of her aging face and hands, and she was then 72 at the time, and would die in 1933. In profile, on an oblique, with her hands clasped in her lap. It's likely that this was also staged for publicity purposes. In 1929, the KPD saw a surge in their ranks owing to increasing state violence on the part of the Social Democratic and Center Liberal parties then in control. In May that year, for example, dozens of demonstrators had been killed by the police, and the KPD began describing the German Socialist Party, the SPD, as, quote, the left wing of fascism, unquote. Moholy relayed that Neubauer himself had arranged the meeting with Zetkin, and this could have been due to these new developments. Moreover, this was the year that Neubauer, a recently elected member of the Reichstag, was able to move to Berlin, emerging from hiding in Düsseldorf, where he had been living under a false name in order to avoid arrest for his participation in an uprising in Thüringen. As a member of the Reichstag, he now had immunity against the charges and could once again move freely in public. And it could be that he orchestrated the photo op with Moholy as one of the KPD's most famous leaders in order to generate support for his own career and for the party more generally at this really crucial moment in its history. As Moholy relayed in her 1947 letter to Jacobi, she dates the beginning of her exile, to England that is, to Neubauer's months of illegality, as she describes it, beginning in February 1933, when Neubauer again went into hiding following the Reichstag's fire and the outlawing of the KPD Germany-wide. It was either then or a few months later, in July, when Neubauer moved out of his rented room on Schutterstrasse in Berlin, following the arrest of a colleague by the Gestapo, that he began staying with Moholy at her Berlin apartment. The couple had agreed that should he be arrested, she would, quote, have to leave the country, since not being his wife, there was nothing I could do for him, unquote. And so it's an important point, and maybe a minor one, but although Moholy had Jewish heritage, it was really this close association with Neubauer that drove her into exile. And so she's coming to England as a political exile and not as a Jewish refugee. With only that which she could carry with her, Moholy traveled first to her family in Prague and then to Vienna, where she followed the reports of the Reichstag's fire trial between October and December that year. We're still in 1933, in which Neubauer was called as a potential suspect. With no evidence presented for his detainment, Moholy resolved to campaign for his release. And this brought her to Paris, she recalls, where she appealed to various newspapers in order to publicize Neubauer's unjust imprisonment, eventually finding a sympathetic ear at the Paris office of the London Times. It was through the Times that Moholy befriended the English writer and socialite Elizabeth Babesco, who was then living in Paris and married to a Romanian aristocrat. In April 1934, Babesco submitted 2 letters to the editor of the Times, taking up Neubauer's case. In both, she makes a case for the horrendous conditions of the German concentration camps, a quote-unquote series of anonymous hells springing up all over the country, she writes. In contrast to the camps, she says rather sardonically, prison in Germany has become a synonym for paradise. Calling on world opinion and the mobilization of public indignation, and these are all quotes from Babesco's letters in the Times, she criticizes the moral laziness of those who do not want to be stirred, likely referring to her English audience. In both letters, she mentions Herr Dr. Neubauer specifically, one of a handful of eminent men who need no introduction to the English public. Arguing that, quote, only foreign public opinion can save Herr Dr. Neubauer, she devotes the last paragraph of one letter entirely to his detainment. And here I'll read from that. Dr. Neubauer was a communist deputy. He could have left Germany, but he refused to do so in order not to leave his friends in the lurch. He was arrested on August 3rd, taken to the Brandenburg and Havel concentration camp, and appallingly mistreated. It was his testimony in the Reichstag's trial, heroic when you consider that he was still in the cells of the authorities, that was largely responsible for Troeller, and she's referring to one of the main suspects in the trial, for his acquittal. Owing to wounds received during the war, Dr. Neubauer is in very delicate health. The camp in which he is now confined, Esterwege, lies in a swamp district. Here he works in mud up to his waist. An ill man cannot survive these conditions. The latest news is that his life is in danger. Given the lack of transparency around the health of prisoners in Germany, it was very likely Moholy that relayed to Babesco such details as Neubauer's war injuries, having had an intimate relationship with him, and his detainment, which Moholy had learned about, as she put it, quote, naturally from indirect sources, unquote. It was through Babesco's encouragement, and Babesco was the daughter of a former British Prime Minister, that Moholy first went to London in spring 1934. It must have been a matter of months after these letters. Only returning to collect her things once she saw that, quote, the readiness to help in England was much greater than anywhere else, unquote. As indicated by her French residency application, she arrived in Britain sometime before the end of June 1934, which is the date that it expired. You can see that on the right. Babesco had put Moholy in touch with her mother, Babesco's mother, the Countess of Oxford and Asquith, who played an instrumental role in obtaining Moholy's residency in Britain. And in fact, one of the earliest portraits that Moholy took in London was of Babesco's mother. It is unequivocally the best of the group of 40-some portraits that she took in these 3 years. And Moholy had also included it in her book on photography. And this is because, in my view, Moholy's mode of sort of depersonalized mode of portraiture is at its most extreme. This collision of a well-known sitter who belonged to the most prominent strata of British society with the almost complete obfuscation of facial features, the shadow, and this intense focus on incidental details, on these strands of hair here, her earlobe, and especially this part of her scarf. You can see how shallow her depth of field was. Although the Countess of Oxford and Asquith had complained in a note to Moholy, quote, I hate, and she underscores hate, all photographs of myself, she was very pleased with Moholy's, saying that they, quote, are quite different from the modern photography which goes in for what might be called beauty parlors, Your photographs make real men and women, and again, she underscores real. Neubauer, in other words, haunts these English portraits. Moholy later credited the Countess of Oxford and her friends as having introduced her to, quote, many influential people who made it known through all possible means in talks, lectures, articles, etc., that a well-known man, Neubauer, had been taken off to a concentration camp, unquote. Those possible means even included a trip to Germany by the Quaker Elizabeth F. Howard on Neubauer's behalf, and by G.C.T. Giles, a prominent educator and member of the British Communist Party. On the British Committee for the Relief of German Teachers, Giles had represented a group of about 60 professors from Cambridge and Oxford who had signed a petition protesting Neubauer's detainment. Giles traveled with two of these professors to Berlin in 1934 to speak with the authorities about Neubauer's release, although to no avail. In a gesture of goodwill to Russia, Neubauer was eventually released in 1939 and even given a factory position in Thuringen before arrested again in 1944 after leading an underground group of political dissidents and then executed by decapitation in a Brandenburg prison. Moholy's photograph ironically played a role in the DDR reconstruction of Neubauer as a communist hero, as well as this loyal family man. And here's a page from one of these East German biographies of Neubauer in the 50s. Although, again, her name is not credited to the photograph, and it, of course, doesn't appear anywhere in the text. Similarly, Neubauer remains an enigmatic figure in Moholy's own biography. Besides her statement on his importance for her British emigration, the only other piece of textual evidence testifying to his presence in her life is an enigmatic letter addressed to a, quote, Mrs. Neubauer at her London address, thanking her for sending a copy of her, quote, learned book on photography, unquote. So to conclude, I'd suggest that we see Moholy's English portraits as an oblique response to her adopted country's concern over the increasing violation of civil liberties in mid-1930s Germany. Moholy's sitters were directly or indirectly Neubauer's defenders. Whether they were part of the pacifist Quaker movement, the organized communist left in Britain, a protesting academia, or the ranks of journalists vocally critical of Hitler, as was Frederick Voigt in his role as a diplomatic correspondent in Berlin for the Manchester Guardian. As one of the most public of the German political prisoners to attract British attention in the 30s, largely due to Moholy's efforts, Neubauer rallied this liberal, primarily bourgeois, anti-fascist movement as unlikely defenders of this radical and foreign communist. His case evidenced what Ernest Barker, whom we see here, a political science and Cambridge professor, called the rise of a, quote, new nationalism. Barker was himself the subject of one of Moholy's most experimental English portraits. And I say experimental because here the edges of the photograph notably do not correspond to the sitter's body, but to his shadow cast against the wall. What was new about this nationalism, Barker contended, was the extreme occlusion of the individual, his or her obfuscation by a monolithic and mythical subject embodied in the supreme power of the state. Citing Neubauer's case specifically, Barker argued that such developments in Germany necessitated sharpening definitions of British liberalism in order to distinguish it from this rising threat. Moholy's photographs, in other words, originate from and obliquely respond to this unwritten chapter on civil liberties in the interwar history of the two countries, simultaneously staging the individual as inscrutable and therefore potentially ineffective, while at the same time insisting that we scrutinize it nonetheless. The images portray a class on the verge of witnessing its own imminent annihilation. What followed were the frantic efforts to preserve whatever could be salvaged of that bourgeois subject. Thank you.